The context for this talk today is Motion 101, which is, Vance sort of set up about where the world was and acceptance of our idea of protecting half the world in 2009. And then here's where we are in 2021. And I'm going to take you on the journey with a little bit more detail now. So here's present context. This is from the body IPBES or IPBES that advises the Convention on Biological Diversity. Nature is declining at unprecedented rates with a million species at risk of extinction, and our own well-being is at risk. It's a pretty big problem. Here's what the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the analog organization, but under the Climate Convention, said. Climate's already changing. As I sit here today, Canada is shattering heat records. It's unbelievably hot up here. We're on a path to risking serious and pervasive, irreversible impacts, and we need unprecedented transitions across all of society. Here's the United Nations Environment Program talking about the pandemic releasing an unprecedented human development crisis, and that it was superimposed on unresolved tensions between people and the planet, between haves and have-nots. And then last December, just 6 months ago, Secretary General Guterres said the following: the state of our planet is broken. Humanity is waging a war on nature, a suicidal war, and making peace with nature must be the defining task for everyone everywhere in the 21st century. This is pretty big stuff. There's basically three things we need to do to get our act together with nature and get ourselves into the zone of having a positive and hopeful future instead of a dire one. We need to shift to sustainable production. We need to shift to more sustainable consumption. And as a foundation of it all, we need to protect nature, places, species, and processes, the whole system, from the organism up to the Earth's whole function. I'm going to focus in on that middle stuff to protect nature, because that's what this Motion 101 and the whole Nature Needs Half movement is about. So first off, it's really important when we talk about biodiversity, which is often used sort of as an analog to nature, that we understand that biodiversity occurs at three scales. We often only use it on the first scale, this definition from the Convention on Biodiversity, meaning species, genes, and ecosystems. And most of the time we just talk about species when we say biodiversity. But it's more than that. It's those three things at that level, species, genes, and ecosystems. But at the next scale, also defined in the Convention on Biological Diversity, is ecosystem, which is a dynamic complex of those three things, species, genes, and ecosystems interacting with abiotic processes, like rivers that run, like rainfall. And all of that is part of an ecosystem. So it's got two components, what in the Western mindset we think is living, and these natural processes, which we think of as inanimate. Of course, an Indigenous person sees them all as alive, and I believe that they're right, by the way. And at the third scale is this idea of a healthy planet. This is from the language of the vision of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We need to talk about the healthy planet, or in Rio Principle 7, the Earth ecosystem's health. And this applies to all of the Sustainable Development Goals, all the Rio conventions like the Climate Convention, but we forget about it all the time. So we have these three scales we have to think about that are at all time need to be accomplished for us to have a healthy world. So how much of the world do we need to protect to achieve that? Really important question. And the mechanisms that we have are, of course, protected areas, and then these other effective area-based conservation measures, which is an area that's effective to protect even though its primary objective isn't nature protection, whereas the protected area's primary objective is nature protection. This is the global target we have at present. There's also been this traditional knowledge from the Indigenous side that was pushing us in this direction for many years as well. Wild 8 in Alaska, Vance talked about Herb Norwegian as chair of the Native Lands and Wilderness Council, calling on all First Nations to demand protection of at least half their Indigenous territories. When we launched the idea of Nature Needs Half in the closing ceremony in Mexico at Wild 9, right from the start, we were talking about the Western science and the perspective of indigenous worldviews coming together, calling for this much larger scale of protection. Then subsequently, we had the nature needs half idea operating, and then E.O. Wilson, using another method called the species area curve, came out with his idea of half Earth in 2015, 2016. Tony Hiss, who I see on the line, is the sort of the guy who came up with the catchphrase half Earth. I was appointed chair of a global committee about 4 or 5 years ago to look into what is the amount necessary to achieve the basic purpose of the Convention on Biodiversity, which is healthy biodiversity, and also to figure out how to get it implemented. This is so we did the largest survey of conservation scientists ever done on the topic of area-based conservation. We got responses from 363 scientists from 81 countries, tremendous coverage. And we asked, what do you think of target 11, 17% land and freshwater, 10% ocean? Overwhelming agreement. It's nowhere near enough. Overwhelming. You can see that orange bar there. Then we asked, in recent years, there's been calls to scale up, like Nature Needs Half and Half Earth, and the World Conservation Congress's motion for 30% marine. To what extent do you agree with large percentage area-based targets? There's the answer. 78% agreed or strongly agreed. This is an overwhelming agreement among scientists. You ever worked with scientists? Wow. To get that kind of empirical wow response. More recently, like in May, these are the filings that France and the European Union did to the formal Convention on Biological Diversity technical process. And I've just excerpted 2 quotes, one from France. Though the science agrees that a 30% protection of terrestrial marine areas is needed, some studies converge on the idea that 50% protection by 2050 would protect. 30% should not be seen as a maximum value. On target 2, says the European Union, science supports at least 30% land and sea. Some point to the need to protect up to half. You can see that this is really where we need to be, and 30% can be an interim milestone by 2030, but where we really need to be going is half. This is from the G7 Leaders Nature Compact signed early this month. And this is a really powerful document. I urge everyone to download and familiarize yourself with. This is signed by President Biden, President Macron, Prime Minister Johnson, Prime Minister Trudeau, on behalf of their countries, saying our world must not only be net zero on the carbon side, but also nature positive. And this important concept of nature positive is at large in the world. You can check it out at naturepositive.org. And you'll see that they commit to supporting a drive for new global targets to conserve and protect at least 30% of global land and at least 30% of global ocean by 2030 as a foundation for the conservation and restoration efforts required this decade. So you can get a sense of where we are. This is politically a document signed by the top political figures in these 7 countries of most of the largest economies in the world, except for China. There's a way to get there. We have to think about the whole world, sustainability across all of the world, both in terms of protection and also production. This framework was developed by our task force because you can't protect half of everything in a rote way, because in some cases it's unimaginably difficult to do, and in the other cases it's not enough. So how do you think about that across the landscape? And this idea of 3 conditions has emerged. And the idea is that in the cities and farm areas, this 18% that's sort of brown, that's where we focus on things like pollination, restoration, keeping nutrients out of rivers, feeding people, giving people in urban centers access to nature, regenerative agriculture to store carbon, but we will not achieve large protection targets. We need to save all the fragments and then do restoration. In the middle condition, which is less than half converted by humanity up to less than half of 1% converted by humanity, we need to be thinking about interconnected systems of protected areas, ideas like Yellowstone to Yukon, or the Great Eastern Ranges in Australia, or things like that, where we think about the interconnectedness of the whole landscape and we have practices around them that are compatible. And in the green areas, the large wild areas, which is about 27% of the earth, we need to keep them intact. And in particular, these are often homelands to indigenous people. We need to keep that system running. And it's about more than the parts. It's about the whole thing functioning. Like in the Amazon, the science appears to be that if we clear more than 20% of the Amazon rainforest, it may flip to being a savanna. In other words, it's not a rainforest anymore. And that's that third scale I talked about at the beginning. It's that Earth system level. We have to be thinking about that, the functioning of the system, not just its parts. And this takes us to this need to think at the scale of protecting at least half the world as fast as possible. This is just out last couple of weeks. This is a report, a scientific output of a workshop of the IPBES, which is the biodiversity group I mentioned, and IPCC, which is the climate expert group I mentioned. And they talk about, up at the top, limiting global warming to ensure a habitable climate and protecting biodiversity are mutually supporting goals, and their achievement is essential. The two are interconnected fundamentally. They're not separate topics. You can't do one without the other. And they recommended this three conditions approach be adopted for achieving these goals of integrating nature and the climate. And they here at the bottom, they also talk about larger tax systems like the Amazon being essential for the functioning of the world. It's not just the Amazon, northern Canada's boreal forest, the Congo Basin, Southeast Asia's peatlands, and other places. The oceans, super important for the function of the planet, not just for the fish. So where are we in the politics of this? This is the draft post-2020 global biodiversity framework that will replace that IHE target 11, 17, and 10. These are the three pieces that are currently in discussion. It's being updated now. Soon there'll be a draft 1 instead of a 0 draft, as this is called. And you'll see there are three elements here. Target 1 talks about retaining most of the existing attacked wilderness areas and connectivity among them. That's an important value. Target 2 is protect and conserve at least 30%. That's important. And then target 7 is increase contributions to climate change mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. These three things are really important. They're not finalized, though. We don't know if those are the outcomes. But right now, the 30% number is the number that's being discussed as the global target. And you can see that at least 30% is progress, but it's not what's needed. It's huge progress, not to be knocked, not to be undermined, but it's not what we need to do ultimately. Which brings us to motion 101, the reason we're having this little event today. We have a motion that cleared the IUCN's motion processes for the World Conservation Congress that's coming up in Marseille, France, the beginning of September. This event occurs every few years. And the motions at this event tend to be very persuasive, partly because they represent the NGO houses of all the IUCN members, and because there are countries that have a kind of a senatorial role in the IUCN. This motion is one of very few that wasn't done through online voting. It was viewed as important enough that it needed to be on the floor in Marseille to discuss. And I've just pulled out excerpts of two critical parts. You can read the longer motion 101, but here's the two critical parts of it. Setting area-based conservation targets based on evidence of what nature and people need to thrive is the subject. Number 1, we call on the IUCN to protect, conserve, and restore, and you'll see square brackets. At least 30% was initially inserted during the discussion process. Our original draft of this motion was at least half or more of our planet. So this is going to be discussed. We're trying to organize with our colleagues to say, this motion needs to say at least half. That doesn't mean 30% is not good, but it needs to say what it needs to say, which is at least half, because that is where the science is. And at least 30% is a very good thing, fully supportive as an interim goal and all that, but it needs to say at least half. And the methods we've identified are identifying, conserving, and effectively and equitably managed protected areas and other effective conservation measures. That's the guts of it. That's what we want to organize to get past. It's a very exciting time. If you compare it to where Vance said we were in 2009, which was floating this idea out to the world with a great reception at the meeting, but some people who are a little slower on the uptake afterwards, to being squarely on the table of the central international global agenda right now. It's been an exciting journey, but for the sake of the world, it can't be just a journey we feel good about. It has to be a journey that continues to be a lodestar that pulls conservation targets up to the point where we actually have a hope of having an optimistic, nature positive, carbon neutral, and equitable 21st century.
before we start the discussion, I just want to quickly introduce all of our attendees to a resource that we've pulled together for anybody who's interested in being part of this historic effort, this historic moment for our planet and for conservation, and helping with the campaign on Motion 101. So if you look in the chat, I just posted a link to natureneedshalf.org/motion-101. And I'm now going to share my screen very quickly and show you, walk you through this page and show you some of the resources there. Before I do that, I want to be clear that we don't see this as the end all be all for the Motion 101 campaign. This is essentially a starter kit, and it's for those who want to engage but don't have a lot of time. If you want to make your own content, if you want to borrow from this content, please do. If you want to share, if you want to make content and then share it with us so that we can reshare it, we'd be happy to do that. And so I offer this only as a way to stimulate content creation, not to stifle it. So this page has a quick summary about Motion 101 and just a brief discussion about what Harvey and Vance have already covered. There's a quick FAQ on this page, and if you just click on these little plus buttons, you'll find the answer to each one of those questions, and hopefully this will help you become a strong advocate or a stronger advocate for Nature Needs Half and for Motion 101. We have a how you can help section under endorse Motion 101. If you click through to that, you'll find a little endorsement petition where you can sign your name and your affiliation and show your support for Motion 101. There's a Be an Ambassador section. This will take you to our Survival Revolution page where you can sign up to be an ambassador on a monthly basis for our HAF communications and just sharing with the world and with your networks about the importance and need for Nature Needs HAF. Finally, there's Sign the Global Deal for Nature. Harvey mentioned this in his presentation. There's close to 4 million signatures on that petition. We will be using it both at the IUCN and at the COP15, the United Nations Biological Diversity Convention of the Parties. So please, if you have not signed that, please do sign it. We have some quotes from some of endorsers of Motion 101 here. And finally, we get to the Motion 101 toolkit. And this is what these are the resources I think you might find most useful and that I hope that our attendees will commit to sharing. The first is for those who are a little bit more technologically savvy. This includes a content calendar on Google Docs, which will show you the messages and the posts that we would like to be shared on what dates. And then there's a folder for graphics in case you have difficulty downloading the graphics from Google Docs, you can download them from this folder. So I'll click through here quickly and show you what this looks like. So if we would like to share our network to share one post a week during the month of August in the lead up to the IUCN World Conservation Congress. And those are these posts right here. There are thumbnail images that our very talented team at Wild, especially led by Cassie Klusman, have pulled together for this. And I encourage you especially to use the hashtag IUCN Congress, because that's where Congress delegates will be looking for all things IUCN related. And we would love to positively flood that hashtag channel with content in favor of Motion 101. This is going to be a living document. So throughout the Congress itself, we will have messages on a daily basis that you can be sharing to the IUCN hashtag. And those will be uploaded into that document in advance of the Congress. There's also these educational presentations, one for NGO audiences, one for government audiences. If you have a chance to advocate with your network for Nature Needs Half and somebody from the Nature Needs Half steering committee can't be there, or you want to be the ambassador for that, we encourage you to download these presentations and use them in order to help promote the Nature Needs Half idea and Motion 101 with your networks. Oops. Finally, we have, whoops, let me click back here. Oh, there we go. Finally, we have the social content. If you don't want to use a Google document, you can share directly from this web page. And again, we'll be adding more, or we already have our September content here. So you can either right click on these images to download them and then re-upload them to your social channels. You can copy and paste the message, or you can click on one of these buttons, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn, and share these images and the associated messages directly from this web page onto your social media channels. Again, this, and finally at the bottom of this page, we have some further reading, some of the articles that Harvey mentioned in his presentation, and a few others around the science supporting Nature Needs Half. Again, this is just a starter, and we would love it if all of you would commit to sharing this, and we'll be sending out emails in the future as a reminder. Even better is if you can get others to share, and if you are so inspired to create content around why Motion 101 and Nature Needs Half is important for you, to share that with your networks and to share it with us, because we'll happily repost that. Harvey, I wanted to, I wanted you to go a little bit more into the relationship between 30 by 30 and Nature Needs Half, how you saw that playing out, especially in the light of the Paris Climate COP, and how we can, even though we all know that half is the target, how we can work together to support each other.
Well, to start with, they're compatible goals, they're not conflicting goals. That's the first and biggest point. At least 30% by 2030 seems to be the political moment that we're in terms of getting that agreed potentially at the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's already agreed at the G7 leaders level. It's already in the High Ambition Coalition for People in Nature, which is over 60, I think it's nearing in on 70 countries have signed that. It's chaired by Costa Rica, France, and the UK. There's a lot of momentum on deep or significantly increasing spatial conservation targets. It's a very good thing. However, we want to get the lodestar established that we all should know it's half. And it's a bit like some of the things I went through at the end. Even if you're agreeing on 30 by 2030, acknowledge that where we really need to be is here, which is half, at least half. And then that way we can continue to pull our efforts along. And on the climate side, it's very similar. We need carbon neutrality yesterday, but we're working towards it slowly. But the goal is carbon neutrality. It's not anything else. And so we've just got to ensure that there's this pull factor where people know that milestones and success and progress is not the same as achieving what you need to achieve. And the process globally is the Climate Change Convention, which tends to have more power, more money, and more interest than the Biodiversity Convention, is going to be focusing on nature for the first time this year at the Glasgow Climate COP. And so these ideas of spatial targets are very much in the mix now in the climate conversation. And if people are interested in this interplay between nature and the climate, I strongly urge you to look at that recent report by IPBES and IPCC on the biodiversity climate interface, because those are the two bodies that advise those two conventions, and they talk a lot about this stuff. And so what we're seeing is a merger, thank God. And one of the other things we talked about at Wild 9 in 2009 is the need to merge nature and the climate together. And Brendan Mackey and I did a paper that was a setup paper for that called The Nature of the Climate, in which we pointed this all out. And again, sometimes things take time. This is 12 years later, but now it's a central conversation in the conversation of the world. And so this piece of just making sure that there's a clear voice that what we need to do is protect at least half the world is a central animating background feature that needs to be in the mix at this entire year coming. That's the idea here. It's not to undermine, supplant, or in any way harm that 30 by 30 effort. In fact, it's completely synergistic and with it. To get somewhere, you have to know where you're going. And that's what a lodestar is. You know, and Tony Hiss has just finished writing a lovely book about what this might look like in a North American context, called Rescuing the Planet. So there's a whole book on that Tony wrote, and others have done other things. To me, saying clearly where we need to get is a precondition to getting there, and having the whole world come together, the World Conservation Congress, to say this is where we need to get, would make a huge difference to everyone's effort, would float everyone's boat. This is about being inclusive, not exclusive. It's not about my methodology over your methodology, my priorities over your priorities. It's about we're all in this together, and we all have to push hard on this, and every piece that we do together can serve this greater good. That's the core idea.
Well, this is Tony Hiss talking. Thank you for that lovely mention of my book, Harvey. I do think you could add it to your reading list on the 101 site for people who are just trying to get up to speed about this and are less familiar with some of the concepts and are just getting introduced to them. In my book, I do try to, in terms of talking about overall vision, suggest that really what people are getting in touch with now inside themselves is the reality of the biosphere, which has always seemed the weirdest kind of place in the world. But this layer of life that sustains us all species, has the peculiar nature of being both infinite, stretched side to side, and ancient, and tiny when looked at as a third dimension, because so much of life has to exist in this narrow band between the bottom of the oceans and the top of Mount Everest, a distance of only 12.5 miles, which if stretched out horizontally, you could drive across comfortably in 20 minutes. So we're coming to terms with this precariousness as well as specialness of this place. And I think that's the kind of thing astronauts find when they look back at the Earth, but now those of us who are down here for the long haul are beginning to incorporate.
On the importance of restoration and rewilding in order to achieve our targets as well. You know, first priority is protect. That Harvey's mentioned that. I mean, that goes without saying. And yet the opportunity and need to not only restore, which generally means to bring back to function for human use, a lot of hammered landscapes and seascapes, but also rewild. And it's linked not only to science and practical species reintroduction for species sake, but for climate sake. And this concept of animating the carbon cycle that we're advocating for now as part of the UN decade, and as a very necessary partner to meeting all the climate goals. The impact of wildlife and wild species on the carbon cycle is the least known, most exciting and important aspect of meeting the climate goals. We know the energy and the emissions aspects, but suddenly nature is emerging. And as Harvey said, biodiversity and species are just an analog for the nature and the importance of the nature-climate connection. So I encourage everybody to also think in this direction too: protect, restore, rewild as a pathway for meeting our goals.
I wondered if Harvey or any of you might be able to talk a little about your perception of the way that government is responding to these kinds of ideas and agitations that you are so good at. You'll understand that I have a degree of skepticism about the way in which most people in most governments are likely to respond to anything like this, or to begin to understand it.
So Bob, just to out you, Bob was one of the most successful wilderness legislators in the history of Australia, which puts him in a world-class elite of government official legislators. So he's being a little humble when he asked the question. The short answer, Bob, is that we have tremendous political momentum for this idea of scaling up conservation materially. That political momentum right now is kind of centered on this idea of protecting at least 30%. I think the G7 leaders statement, leaders 2030 nature compact, in which they commit to each other to this, is actually the first global agreement with that kind of elevated ambition in an agreement. And I think it's an important milestone. I urge you all to look at it. And I understand Australia was there observing and then came home and joined the High Ambition Coalition to commit to protecting 30% by 2030, or so I heard. So even down under there with the government that hasn't been famous for its enthusiasm for these things, felt the need to join the club.
Harvey, that particular commitment by that particular government was probably accidental.
They took a wrong turn on the exit ramp. Anyway, but to make a long story short, some countries, of course, are already out there. Bhutan already has half its country protected in an interconnected way. There are countries, some of the big ocean countries have huge amounts of their marine realm protected. So we have some actual actors who are already there, and we should acknowledge and admire them very much. But the idea of just putting down this North Pole or Southern Cross or whatever you want to call it, North Star, Southern Cross, to help pull everybody in the direction that the science and the indigenous knowledge say we should be at, is, in my view, something that achieves and exerts a gravitational pull on political conversations. It truly does. Like, if you talk about what's needed, it pulls everything there politically across the spectrum. And so, for an example, is that in a northern territory of Canada called Yukon Territory, one of the parties in the last election said we need a nature needs half world, working with indigenous peoples to protect it. And they have the balance of power now in the Yukon legislature. That's pretty interesting. There it is in a platform, in a political setting, all of a sudden. And that kind of thing, I think, can happen more and more.
Hi, Amy. Hi, Harvey. Hi, Vance. Great to see you guys.
Hi, Keith.
Congratulations. Really fantastic work and very inspiring. And I just want to touch on that point, because I think, Vance, you raised the issue around rewilding as well. And I just want to draw up, and I'm very keen to hear your views on this, but the distinction between net zero and nature needs half. And that is that net zero emissions, of course, is not really very exciting. It's not very inspiring. It's obviously there is so many economic opportunities arising out of the transition to a net zero emissions world. But on the flip side, the whole concept of nature needs half Earth and rewilding is actually really inspiring. It's really exciting, and it's very positive. It's such a positive messaging. The Rewilding Europe team had their 10th anniversary just yesterday, and I thought it was a fantastic production, just like this one is. One of the comments made in that really struck me, and there was one of the young ladies who was talking about I think it was called the Youth Rewilding Europe, or Rewilding Europe for the Youth or something. And she said, what inspires me here is the hope it gives me. It's the hope that it gives me. Rewilding a continent, it gives her hope. And I think that really struck me, because that's what we all need. In this heat wave that's occurring in Canada, Harvey, which is that's like Western Australian temperatures. That's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh.
And very, very uncomfortable. Unfortunately, we're going to see more of it.
Yeah.
And as you know, I'm in the finance world, back in the finance world, and I try to have these conversations every day. And one of the challenging conversations I'm having at the moment is when people say, "Look, we've got enough on our plate with climate, and now you're asking us to deal with nature and biodiversity as well." And I'm like, well, we're going to have to do both. But I guess one of the things I really wanted just to get your views on quickly was this point about the inspirational factor. In my mind, it's such a exciting story around the transition to a nature needs half world, and just be keen to get your respective views on how we can elevate that image relative to net zero, because it's such a positive story. And you're all great communicators, but just love to hear your views about how we can elevate that perspective to make it sit alongside net zero emissions and being just as important, because at the moment they're not. I mean, Harvey, you made the point, there's no way, it's not close to the climate movement, if you like, at least in the business world, in the private sector. So keen to get your views on that little ramble I just gave.
Keith, thank you for the great question. And this is the types of questions that keep me up at night. And I'm firmly a believer in silver buckshot, not in silver bullets. I don't think there's a one size fit all answer to this. And I don't think we've discovered all the answers we need. That being said, one of the pieces of silver buckshot that we are utilizing now is a more marketing-based approach. So we're simultaneously playing institutional inside baseball, which is needed, but we're also beginning to expand our efforts into the mass public to cultivate influencer networks around the world and to gain their commitment in sharing materials, and then creating content that will be read and understood by the public that we're reaching out to. And our approach right now is fairly formulaic. If you care about XX, you care about wild nature, and you care about protecting half. And XX can be putting dinner on the table at night. It could be getting a clean, safe glass of water. It could be your children's future. It could be, this one little story that went viral and made it big. We're connecting those issues that other people already care about to the protection of wild nature to show them how what is oftentimes perceived as a remote issue, some national park or some rainforest somewhere distant, is actually an issue that is in their backyard and actually in their household as well. So that's one of the pieces, but there are many other components to this campaign. And I want to hand it over to Harvey and Vance to talk about those.
So Keith, at the highest level, and I know you're conscious of this, there are other things going on as well that are out there that I think are very important, that are endeavoring to address all three prongs: sustainable consumption, sustainable production, and spatial conservation. So this idea of a nature positive world, which is the effort to roll up all of this stuff into a direction, of a hopeful direction, that I've also been very, very involved in, that I think is it's all part of where we need to go. And the ultimate sort of integrated vision that I think we need is an equitable, nature positive, carbon neutral world, so that we bring it all together. It's mutually synergistic, and we're just talking about hope. This piece here is about defining this piece has to happen at this scale. Let's keep it in mind as we get there. That's kind of the short summary of why this Motion 101 thing seems like a good thing. And then, just to come back to sort of where hope lies, what's so interesting to me, and we're actually making progress at the public policy level on this stuff in Canada right now, which is, we've had our dark days too, but it's actually almost easier to integrate nature and the climate than it is to keep them separate, because people get that we're talking about the world, and we've become so specialized and so down a notch that people, why do we care about the climate? Because of what it's going to do to nature. It's going to cause fires and floods and heat waves, right? That's why we care about it. We don't care about it for any other reason. Nobody counts parts per million and sits up at night worrying, oh God, there's one more part per million. They're only worried about what it's going to do to us on Earth, which is what gets down to the level Amy's talking about, which is the place we get our food, fresh water, stable climate, growing conditions, air to breathe from. And so at a simpler level, rolling it up together is actually better than trying to specialize and keep it apart. And I think we've been bedeviled by that separation.
Yeah.
And the fundamental thing is, in the 21st century right now, we're looking at a giant raw omelet of despair that's rapidly cooking. What we need to do is turn that into a tasty dish of hope that gives young people a hope that they're not going to be handed a burnt omelet and told, eat it, that's your future. We need to say, oh no, we still got time to turn this into something you're going to like. And that means working big and working fast and being inspired and being unapologetic, pushing and pulling, but also putting on a big smile and saying, we're for something positive, which is what you were getting at, Keith. This is fun. This is cool. This is exciting. This is the world I want to live in. And yeah, it's all going to shit, but I don't care because this is the world I want to live in and I want to turn it around.
Right.
So to me, that's our job as ambassadors across the board, to have that big smile of hope and vision and come on with me and let's go here together.
Now, I'll really back that up too, Keith. It's a really good question you asked, because it's the essential engine. Science is important, traditional knowledge is important, but the essential engine is what world do we want to live in, period. And the stories, and this is one of the things that I really like about the increasing emphasis now on the rewilding narrative, because it's an activity that does not defend, it creates. And it's something that is happening all over the world. I mean, I've been amazed since this alliance started, coming out of the planning for Wild 11. I've been astounded to see the extent of rewilding around the world at all scales. And so one of the things we're going to be doing through this alliance as part of reaching our Nature Needs Half goals is telling the stories, because there's some really, really cool, inspiring stories. And this is why it generates hope, because people can use their hands, they can, and in their own area, and they can contribute towards a Nature Needs Half world. And most importantly, the essential vision of what kind of world do I want, and I can help to create it. So
If I
Thank
could
you. Very, very
chime
well
in
said.
for-
thanks, Keith.
If I could chime in for a sec, it's Tony again. I think that as the Nature Needs Half or Half Earth concept begins to percolate and permeate, what I've found is it gives a language to people's hopes. I've been working in some built up areas which can never get to half, but they can begin to ask themselves, well, what if we could increase the amount of land we've protected by 30% or by half? That would give us a goal within a goal. And every acre that's protected is in its own tiny way contributing to the Half Earth goal. Just as President Roosevelt established the March of Dimes back in the 1930s to combat TB. Every tiny little bit that a Boy Scout could collect is going to lead to a great breakthrough sooner or later.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony.
If there are no more questions or comments, I want to thank Harvey Locke and Vance Martin for joining us for this webinar. I want to thank all of our attendees, and please urge you to be a part of this campaign, to share the social media, and to do what you think is best in your networks to influence the upcoming decisions that will be happening later this year. Thank you so much for attending this Nature Needs Half Motion 101 briefing, and you'll be receiving a follow-up email in the next few days.
Thank you all so much.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Great job,
Bye-bye.
guys.
Lovely.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.